good evening. Thank you for joining us at our Librarians World series. My name is Nadia, and I'll be the MC this evening. I suppose many of us are here today because we're interested in Southeast Asian archaeology. So what do academics and civil servants have to do with spies and tomb raiders? In today's session, Associate Librarian Fu Shu-ting will share some useful resources from the National Library and introduce a few early pioneers in the development of the field. Tonight, you'll learn more about some of the ancient sites and artifacts in Southeast Asia. Fu Shu-ting is an Associate Librarian of the National Library Singapore and works with the Singapore and Southeast Asia collections. Her responsibilities include collection management, content development, as well as providing reference and research services. Her research interests lie in the anthropology and archaeology of Southeast Asia. I shall now hand over the time to Shu-ting.
Good evening, and thank you for the introduction. I'd like to thank my colleagues at NLB for allowing me the honor to speak to you today. This is a plan for my first talk. First, our introduction on what archaeology is, and an abbreviated history of archaeology, and then some resources at NLB. First, I'd like to acknowledge my biases in recommending the resources for today. For those who don't know me, in a past life, I used to be a project archaeologist for 6 field schools and a teaching assistant at NUS. These experiences color the perception of what kinds of resources are needed. I would also like to give a caveat. This talk is in English, so I've largely focused on recommending resources in English. Southeast Asian archaeology publications are written in every national language and in every scholarly language that you associate with the region, and then some. So my talk merely scratches the surface as to what's out there. If you'd like to know more about my work at NLB or my past research projects, you can use the QR codes to find out more information. Most people's encounter with Southeast Asian archaeology is likely to be a coffee table book like this one at the bookstore, usually while on vacation. For me, I was in the 5th grade in Jakarta, and I read it to earn points for a reading challenge competition. So to my library colleagues, the carrot does work. Little did I know that the author of the book, Professor Miksik, would be my MA thesis supervisor many years later. So why talk about Southeast Asian archaeology, particularly at this juncture? In recent years, there's been a spate of articles and publications that make popular and outlandish claims. Atlantis was in Indonesia, or that the world's oldest pyramid is hidden in an Indonesian mountain. The use of pseudoscience for archaeology is not unique to Southeast Asia. Just this year in 2021, when the Chinese archaeologists were excavating at Sanxingli, some people thought it was the work of ancient aliens, as if to reject the possibility that locals could have the capacity to make such items. So it's time to make archaeology more accessible and to have people have the tools to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of such bold claims themselves. While there's been efforts to combat such misinformation from certain scholars, I've also linked NLB's own information literacy website where you can learn more about how to evaluate such information. One of the ways to evaluate the strength of the pyramid argument is to compare it to other scholarly work on other known pyramid structures in the region, such as this one at Qom in Kokher. National Library has a short guide on the site. For advanced users, ICES has a much more weighty academic publication related to the site by the French epigrapher Jacques, who sadly passed away in 2018. Another way to evaluate the strength of an argument is through looking at the excavator's theories and methods. The rare scrutiny. Here, I've listed 2 for basics textbooks as well as 2 more that might be useful. The one on the top left is a British approach, and then on the one on the top right is a US-based approach. What's the difference, you ask? Well, for most of the world, archaeology is its own separate discipline. But in the US, it's part of anthropology and part of the 4-field approach. When you think of anthropology, you usually think of classic ethnographies, the study of tribes like the Semai. It's a little bit more than that. Personally, I was initially more drawn to social cultural anthropology because of its ability to explain things. As someone who was half Malaysian and half Indonesian, the concept of third culture kids helped me find a sense of self and place when I grew up. The sole premise of archaeology is that the past is knowable. When archaeologists excavate, document the location of each find, and by doing so, they create a set of contextual primary data consisting of artifacts and ecofacts. Artifacts are objects which have been made or modified by humans, while ecofacts are organic materials that have not been modified by humans but carry archaeological significance. Archaeologists can then use that data to interpret what happened at the site when it was last abandoned. This is then published so that others can read it and use it, forming the archaeological record. There's two different types of archaeology, historic and historic. The invention of writing was significant in that things could be recorded for posterity and complex ideas could be transmitted across large distances. In Southeast Asia, writing that survives is usually by way of stone inscriptions or palm leaf manuscripts. Here's an image of Professor Philip Piper's chapter on animal domestication in Southeast Asia from a recent publication. It shows possible routes for how domesticated pigs and chickens were moved across Southeast Asia into the Pacific by way of DNA analysis. It reiterates my earlier point about archaeology's explanatory power. The key thing here is that such theories should be testable and evidence verifiable. Just to show you a little bit more about the archaeological process, it begins and ends in the library, so having a good library helps. As you can see, excavation is only part of the process. In addition to the time dimension, there's also two types of archaeology, research and salvage. Research is one where one excavates to test a research question. Salvage excavations are usually done in response to urban development, where the aim is to preserve information that's there, documentation. There's also different subfields, each requiring different sets of resources. We should also think about what we mean by Southeast Asian archaeology. The term was only popularized during World War II and what it means for the scholarship of the region. As the name implies, it's south of China, east of India. Many works focus on the relationship between these areas. However, as many scholars who work in the field know, the timing of the discoveries for the Pacific also have implications here. Now, though, it's useful to think of Southeast Asian archaeology as archaeology on ASEAN nations. Archaeology also has its limitations. In the strictest terms, archaeology ends where the survey or excavation ends. So in order to understand the ancient world, we need to turn to other works. This work by the late Janet Abu-Lughod, sociologist, is a classic compilation of the trade circuits between Europe and Southeast Asia, and is based on Wallerstein's method of analyzing world systems. It also has a use of table for monsoon sailing dates between the Arabian Peninsula and China. If you were to ask me which works to recommend in general, these two works are good for beginners, so we need a bit of context. Dr. Peter Bellwood's work on the left uses a mix of linguistic and archaeological data to propose a model for the chronology and movement of people in history that's being tested today. Professor Miksic and Professor Goh's book on the right is useful for those studying historical archaeology, particularly societies with Hindu-Buddhist influence, and has many useful maps. So now I'll move on to part one. Archaeology in many parts of Southeast Asia had its roots in 18th to 19th century antiquarianism, with the oldest society being that of the Batavian Society, based in 1778. There's a few exceptions, such as the Philippines and Singapore. Here in Singapore, it's mainly rooted in Professor Miksic's excavation of Fort Canning Hill in 1984. According to the late Benedict Anderson, a well-known scholar, and I quote, "Up until the early 19th century, the colonial rulers in Southeast Asia exhibited very little interest in the antique monuments of the civilizations that subject. Thomas Stamford Raffles, ominous emissary from William Jones, Calcutta, was the first prominent colonial official, not merely to amass a large personal collection of local objects to art, but to systematically study their history. After, with increasing speed, the grandeurs of Borobudur, Angkor, of Pagan, and other ancient sites were successfully disinterred, jungled, measured, photographed, reconstructed, fenced off, analyzed, and displayed. Colonial archaeological services became powerful and prestigious institutions, calling on the services of some exceptionally capable scholar officials." Quote. If you want to access Thomas Raffles' History of Java, for example, NLB has made it available digitally. There's also many illustrations in the history of Java, such as this one for Candi Suku. Archaeologists have been accused of being tomb raiders. There's a big difference. Typically, archaeologists are not allowed to sell artifacts. Tomb raiders often have no legal permit to excavate, operate on a for-profit model, and they usually don't keep notes on the material being extracted. Furthermore, there's evidence to believe that illicit trafficking of artifacts is linked with smuggling rings, money laundering, and terrorism. There's also been accusations that archaeologists are spies. There's some historical evidence for spies using archaeological research covers since World War I. In Southeast Asia, there's reason to believe that certain anthropologists use their ethnographic knowledge to assist the American war effort in the Cold War. Today, it's a little bit more difficult to do as you're vetted for ethics compliance before you begin your research. Your credentials are vetted by national, provincial, and local authorities. After the colonial period, newly independent nations in Southeast Asia saw archaeology as a way to unify its people, to write a commonly shared past. Artifacts deposited in national museums were often arranged in such a way that it presented a unilinear narrative, with the finish being the creation of the present modern state. Today, just as during the colonial period, many of those who were trained or have taken courses in archaeology are co-opted into government, forming the civil servant scholar corps. Were the early archaeologist pioneers all men? No. There are two women whose works are also available at NLP. Madeleine Kalani, she works a lot on megaliths, and Satyawati Sulaiman, who was actually, I think, one of the most influential women in Southeast Asian archaeology. So if you want to know more, I've left the QR codes. While archaeological work on Singapore Island proper dates back to the 1980s, Southeast Asian archaeological work based in Singapore did start during the colonial period. And NLB has copies of the first archaeological excavation report for Gua Kapah, which was excavated in June to December of 1934. It was one of the earliest excavated sites for Peninsular Malaysia, and the earliest excavated shell midden in Southeast Asia. The report was written by Peter Vincent van Stijn-Kallenfels, a Dutch archaeologist who was considered the father of prehistoric archaeology in Indonesia. It should be noted that the site archaeologists were overseeing the excavations were actually Mr. Michael Tweedy and Mr. H.D. Collings, who were staff at the Raffles Museum. So here on the very right is actually a comic. You can find it in the QR code below. It is a caricature of quote unquote, the Ivan the Terrible of Southeast Asian archaeology. Publication marked a foray into the non-biological aspects of the Raffles Museum's activities. And excavation was funded with money from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Publication has hand-drawn maps of other shell middens in the area, so it's quite useful because we don't really know much information about those other middens today. It also has photograph documentation of the site and stratigraphy. It also has limited number of photographs showing wasted stone axes, pottery sherds, as well as some core tools. The most important information garnered is its contextual stratigraphic information. Each artifact was labeled with a number. It could be matched precisely to an estimated location on this side profile. Not everything was correct. This map actually faces south, referenced with a plan view of the site. The most important takeaway is that scholars have to rely on this publication. In 2017, while doing up the construction for the Gua Kapah Archaeological Gallery, archaeologists found a skeleton radiocarbon dated to about 3,800 BCE to 3,750 BCE and nicknamed it the Penang Woman after Java Man. In April 2021, the Malaysian federal government approved a 10 million ringgit fund to develop the Archaeological Site Museum as a heritage gallery. Nowadays, stratigraphy is much easier to read and emphasizes the geological layers, as in this top figure by Karina Arifin. There's approximate locations for where radiocarbon dates were taken so that it's easier for readers to evaluate them. This is particularly important in cave sites where there is evidence for roof collapse. Artifacts above another layer, basically, but may be older due to being displaced. And you'll see on the bottom here, there's actually radiocarbon information, and you can find locations fairly easily. Today, archaeological reports focus on statistical data as well, such as the minimum number of specimens, and this report in particular is good in that it has vernacular names for different taxa so that non-specialists can follow along. So for example, if you see the vernacular names, there's snakes, pythons, monitor lizards, and things like that. So, second phase of archaeological work for Southeast Asia, based in Singapore, was by the University of Malaya's Archaeological Society, which was based at the Department of History. It was first led by Professor C.N. Parkinson, renowned naval historian, perhaps is better known for Parkinson's Law. The post-World War II effort, this endeavor at establishing a local archaeology team was discontinued during separation when Dr. Colin Jack Hinton left Singapore. Some prominent Singaporean members of this archaeology society, names you may know, included Christopher Hui, former director of the National Museum, and Herman Hofstadt, a former top civil servant. National Archives government records for the society has much more information, including AGM minutes, constitution, annual reports of activities, itineraries, correspondence and requests for funding, and excavation collaborators. Java Bali trip, I mentioned earlier, was clearly an exercise in cultural diplomacy. Society members met with the mayor of Jakarta, ambassador for Malaya, minister for education, even met with President Sukarno. For archaeologists and historians, this booklet may be interesting because it also has an essay by Sucipto Wirjosuparto on the interpretation of the Borobudur monument. So you can read some of their research outputs on JSTOR. So basically, they've done the Kuala Muda area in Kedah and Wellesley, and there's also mentions of work in Malaya by Peacock. So. Third phase of archaeological work based in Singapore begins in the 1980s, as I've mentioned earlier, and largely it revolves around these three institutions. I've listed main publishers and terms or locations for where you might be able to find archaeology-related reports. And I would like to highlight Professor Goh and Professor Mixick's recent report on Fort Canning Spice Gardens. The report includes daily site logs that names excavators and other contributors, more formally written report, artifact images, and even data sets that you can download and manipulate CSV. Such data sets will be quite useful for future multi-site analysis. What is it like in archaeology? It can be dangerous. Cambodia, for example, sites have to be safe and cleared from mines before any work can begin. Cobras and scorpions are not uncommon. I've had severe food poisoning many, many times. In some fairly remote areas, we have to be wary of wild animals. There's also a sense of excitement, of adventure. Those who don't know, the bottom right is an example of Banchang pottery, probably one of the most famous pottery types in Southeast Asia. It's from the Banchang site in Thailand. You know it's special because it even made it into a Tomb Raider game. So if you're looking for the bottom left side, it's actually a kiln site at Sukhothai in Thailand. The top left is basically I'm taking a photograph at the bottom of the stairs, looking up that way. So it's a very high climb, and I've been to Angkor many, many times with many, many student groups. So now I turn to what kind of resources there are that's available at NLB. For those new to NLB, I would recommend the OneSearch search engine to look through what's available at NLB and other partner institutions, as it might be easier to find what you're looking for. Virtual Union Catalog would be for power users who want to do multiple library searches in Singapore. As for online resources, there's two online resources that users might be interested in. One is BookSG, where you might be able to find digitized copies of items that are out of copyright. This would include things like early Jawi manuscripts. Sometimes NLB does collaborations with overseas institutions like the British Library, and so you'll find basically PDFs or open access material. Other resources, Newspaper SG. Earliest digitized newspaper at NLB has is for the Singapore Chronicle and Commercial Register, which dates from January 1827 to September 1837. Through its Legal Deposit Act, NLB receives 2 copies of publications from all publishers, such as academic presses, research institutes, heritage institutions, publishers, and societies. These are mainly kept as preservation copies and are kept in a separate facility, but members can request to check them out for a small fee. And so I've highlighted two here. One is on Angkor, the Asian Civilizations Museum, and the other is by ENEOS Press. This one is on the European Association for Southeast Asian Archaeologists. Sometimes NLB also has archaeology-related books as part of prominent donor collections, such as those from Tan Yeok-seong. Mr. Tan was an associate member at the Third Congress of Prehistorians of the Far East in 1938 in Singapore and presented the Sambas treasures. The society is still in existence, but is now called the Indo-Pacific History Association. So if you'd like to learn more, there's a catalog of his collection at the Lee Kong Chian Reference Library. Society that he was part of was also has the longest running regional archaeology journal. And many of its most recent issues are now online for free. But NLB has copies of some of the older proceedings from 1938, 1978, 1990, and 1998. Sambas cache, Mr. Tan Yeok-seong found, is now in the British Museum. If you'd like to find out more about the significance of the discovery, the 1949 issue of the Journal of the Malayan Branch of the Royal Asiatic Society has more information. Since then, there's been a number of publications on it, which you will see on the right here. I'd like to highlight the one for 1949 one. NLB also acquires titles through catalogs, public feedback, and reading review articles. These are some of the more recent titles that NLB has received. So you'll see on the top left something about gold trade, GIS analysis. On the right side, it's about the archaeology of the Riau Islands. On the bottom left is the archaeology of the Indian Ocean world. For the archaeology of Manila galleon, seaports, and early maritime globalization, I think this will be of interest to maritime archaeologists working in the region. For NLB members, you can access ebooks from these two publishers online from NLB's website. With regards to journals, there's 3 databases worth noting: EBSCOhost, JSTOR, and ProQuest Central. Overdrive has actually quite a few archaeology-related books, but for beginners, I would recommend the Anthropology audiobook, and I would recommend the GIS tutorial book for those who want to learn a new skill on how to make maps and analyze data. And finally, a project management for advanced users, as archaeology projects can be quite complicated. I've also listed some Southeast Asian archaeology-related titles for journals on the right side. So in terms of newspapers, a newspaper SG can be a useful source for information on trade goods, Southeast Asian shipping, and shipwrecks. Maritime archaeologists may be interested to learn more about local Southeast Asian ships traded to Singapore prior to the prevalence of steamships. This article shows the tonnage, usual import and export cargo, and included information on the amount of freight-free goods crews were allowed to have in 1829. So as you can see, there's coconut oil, sapan wood, arrow wood, and things like that. And for me, what's interesting is I think a lot of people probably don't know what a pickle is, right? It's basically a shoulder pole. So as much as a man can carry on his shoulder poles, it's basically weighted down and you carry with a bamboo shoulder pole. So the Southeast Asian collection, the National Library reflects Southeast Asian archaeology's vibrancy. There are still research gaps with a lot to learn. Many pioneering scholars are still being referred to today. As archaeological excavations are destructive, it's important to document and preserve documents that have contextual information. It's important to understand that the archaeological process and some of the theories that guard against pseudo-archaeology.